Good afternoon. Welcome to our talk today. My name is Vũ Minh Khương. I'm Associate Professor of Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Our talk today is about migrating to opportunity. This is a very important and interesting topic because of three reasons. The first one, ASEAN is a big player in this game. We export a lot of migrant workers and so receive a lot of migrant workers. The second thing, the issue become more and more important, a growing issue. We can see the share of migrant workers from ASEAN increasing over time. And the third thing, we see a lot of policy issues. We can do a lot in terms of policy to improve the performance of this sector. So we are so excited today, delighted today to have two speakers from the World Bank to present their latest report on this important issue. It's a great honor for me to introduce Dr. Sudhir Shetty, the Chief Economist of East Asian and Pacific of the World Bank. Mr. Shetty currently Chief Economist of the East Asian and Pacific region of the World Bank since 2000. Before that, he was a director of the PREMS, Poverty Reduction and Economic Management. And prior to that, he was a co-director of the team that prepared the World Bank 2012 World Development Report on Gender Equality and Development. Mr. Shetty had a PhD in economics from Cornell University and an MBA from the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. Before joining the bank in 1987, Mr. Shetty was an assistant professor of public policy and economics at the Duke University. Our second speaker today is Mauro Testaverde. He's a lead author of the report. Mr. Testaverde is an economic in the World Bank East Asia and Pacific Social Protection and Labor Unit. Mr. Testaverde has a PhD in economics from the University of Southampton, UK, and a junior fellow of the Royal Economic Society. Without further ado, I would like to give floor to Mr. Shetty, to Dr. Shetty, to make some opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Vu, and thank you for having us here, for giving us this opportunity, and thank you to all of you for your interest in this. As Professor Vu said, I'm the World Bank's Chief Economist for East Asia and Pacific, but unfortunately I'm based in Washington, D.C. So I spend most of my time on airplanes being jet-lagged because really the work is here in the region. But first I should say that periodically we do reports of this sort about this region, and one of the things obviously about the World Bank that differentiates us from our cousins across 19th Street in Washington, D.C. at the International Monetary Fund is that we are concerned with development. So our focus is the developing economies of East Asia. But having said that, occasionally we do reports such as this one, which actually look at both the developing economies of East Asia as well as the advanced economies of East Asia, because ASEAN obviously not only includes a large number of the developing economies of East Asia, but also includes Singapore and Brunei. So this report, and what we try to do with these kinds of reports is speak to obviously partly to governments in the region about public policy issues, but also partly to the citizens of these countries about issues that we think are important. And I hope that by the end of this evening, my colleague Mauro Testaverde and I would have convinced you that labor mobility in ASEAN is a very important policy issue. So with that, let me just make a few opening remarks. This is a report on which Mauro has taken the lead along with some other colleagues, so he's best placed to get into the details. But let me begin with the question of why this report now? by the World Bank. Why is this a relevant issue? And one of the reasons is that the countries of ASEAN, Southeast Asia, stands out in terms of the mobility of people across its borders. Now, obviously, migration happens everywhere, but one of the things that makes ASEAN stand out is the proportion of people who migrate across borders within ASEAN. And one of the facts that we highlight in this report is how, in contrast to most of the rest of the developing world, say South Asia, one of the things that's happened over the last 20 years is that there's been a 10 percentage point increase in the number of people that have moved across borders within ASEAN. So these are people moving from Malaysia to Singapore, from Cambodia or Laos or Myanmar to Thailand, etc. So that's one of the reasons that it's worth looking at this. And this number now stands at something of the order of 7 million people. These are just the documented ones. Now, we also know that the borders in this region, particularly in the continental Southeast Asian countries, are very porous. There are large numbers of undocumented migrants that move across from Myanmar or Laos or Cambodia into Vietnam, into Thailand, for instance. So in that context, one of the things this report asks is, what is behind these movements? What explains this increase in the proportion of people that are migrating within the region? And we show that it's a consequence of two things. One, the rapid economic growth of this region. And that is, one thing that I think for all of you who live in this region, you take it almost for granted that the world is a place full of opportunities and full of growth. If you talk to your colleagues in Latin America or you talk to colleagues in Europe and Central Asia, that's not the state of the world that they know. Countries don't routinely grow at 5% a year as do developing countries in this region. And so that's one aspect. But the second aspect is ASEAN itself is a very diverse region, right? So we're sitting here in Singapore that has, it's almost 25 times richer than the poorest country within ASEAN, Cambodia or Myanmar. Similarly, it's a very old country in relative terms compared to Laos, for instance. So the median age in Singapore is almost twice as high as it is in some of the youngest countries within ASEAN, such as Laos or Myanmar. So there are countries in ASEAN that are aging very rapidly, but there are also, Thailand is another example, but there are also countries that have very young age structures. So these are the factors that lead to these opportunities across borders that people are trying to tap into. So what does this report say about the movement of people within Southeast Asia? And this is something that Mauro will go into much greater detail. One message is that labor mobility is actually a central pillar of the vitality of the continued growth in this region. So so one needs to think about this as a source of continued opportunity rather than as a challenge that has to be managed. So that, I think, is a very important message. And that opportunity accrues to individuals. Clearly when you have the kinds of wage gaps that you have in this region, where it's possible for someone to cross a border and earn 3 times as much as it would be if you go from Cambodia to Thailand, or 5 times as much if you move from Indonesia to Singapore. Those are obviously huge benefits to individuals. We also know that those benefits, a lot of them find their way back to the countries people come from, in the form of remittances, in the form of people themselves going back. And the diaspora, we know from research, is a very powerful source of initiative, of innovation, of growth to the societies they've left. But it's not just the sending countries, it's also the countries that receive these migrants that benefit. I mentioned already the difference in age structures. So for a country like Thailand or Singapore that is aging very rapidly, there's a pool of young labor. There's a pool of younger people who are well within reach, who can come in and make up for the fact that these countries are aging so rapidly. So that's the positive message. But another aspect of the message of this report is to show that inappropriate policies and institutions at the national level in many of these countries are actually cutting into the benefits that could potentially be had from labor mobility. So countries need to look at what they're doing, at how they're managing migration, at how they're managing labor mobility, and ask, how can we improve on this so that individuals and societies can benefit more from this movement of people. So that's why that brings me to the final part of this report, which is the policy aspect, which obviously is very important. What can countries do to enhance these benefits? And what this report shows is that the key here is for countries to match the policies and institutions they have better to their evolving economic needs. So recognizing that at different levels of income, you have different needs as an economy in terms of the kind of labor you want to employ, in terms of the benefits that they can bring. Now, the ASEAN Economic Community, which we all hear a lot about, is a very important step towards greater and closer and deeper economic integration in the region. The point of this report is to say that that vision needs to be broadened beyond the exchange of goods, which is already, we know, quite deep and is truly one of the successes of ASEAN. But it needs to go beyond that to also integrating better flows of people to ensure that countries are doing the right things in terms of promoting mobility and in terms of using these labor flows well within their borders. So that's really, where this report ends is to say that despite all of the progress that has been made in integrating across this region, much more ambitious action is needed within the context of ASEAN as well as by individual countries to benefit more from the flows of people that is already occurring. So with that, let me turn it over to my colleague, Mauro, who can get into the details. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Sudhir. Thanks so much. And thanks, everyone, for being here. I understand it's the end of the day, so I'll do my best to keep you awake and excited. I get pretty excited about this topic, so I think I will try to share that with you. So let me first start by give you an idea of what you can expect by reading this report. And by the way, we brought some copies of the overview here. There is also the bigger report. The report is also available online, so you can check that online as well. So in this report, we have more than 300 pages, 9 chapters. But in a nutshell, what do we really do? First of all, we want to understand how labor mobility affects the well-being of workers in ASEAN. And what we understand, it's important to look at the well-being of not only migrant workers, but also workers in sending and receiving countries. Then we also want to look at the barriers to labor mobility, so the constraints that workers face when they want to move in search of better economic opportunities. What is important also to look at is what is lost when workers cannot move. So part of the report focuses on that too. And finally, we really want to offer policy options for countries in order to reduce barriers to labor mobility and so maximize benefits from migration. So this is pretty much what you can expect from the report. Now, let me start by giving you a couple of facts about migration in ASEAN, in the ASEAN region, and also talking about the drivers of migration within ASEAN. This is something that Sudhir already mentioned. So ASEAN is one of the regions that over the last 20 years experienced a tremendous increase in migration flows. So if you think about all the different regions in the world, and this in the slide you can see how the World Bank defined different regions of the different country groupings, we can see that ASEAN is the only region in which intra-regional migration increased as a share of total migration, which means that workers in ASEAN increasingly go to other ASEAN countries. So this is very important to keep in mind because this happens only in this region, not so much in other regions. Something to also keep in the back of your mind is that out of all total migration in the world, ASEAN countries account for 4% of all the destination countries, and then 8% of all the sending countries. There have been increases over the last 20 years, but these numbers are still pretty small, and then this suggests that barriers to labor mobility exist. And I'm going to elaborate more on these barriers in the next slide. Now, usually we are tempted to classify countries in sending and receiving. We can do that for ASEAN, but also something to keep in mind is that we see a really complex migration patterns in ASEAN. So out of all the migrant population, so we're talking about 6.9 million, most migrants go to Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand. So we're talking about 95%, 96%. But these countries, which are large receiving countries, are sending countries as well. So Malaysia receives a lot of migrants from Indonesia, Vietnam, but also send migrants to Singapore. And these numbers are very large. Singapore receives a lot of migrants, but also send high-skilled migrants outside of ASEAN. Countries like the Philippines, that we all know as a big sending countries, does send a lot of migrants, but not within ASEAN. And then the same is, for example, for Thailand and for Vietnam. So in a way, we have complex migration patterns in ASEAN, outside ASEAN, of high-skilled workers and low-skilled workers. Now, migration corridors are very specific here in the ASEAN region. So there are 10 countries, so you can imagine the migrants can flow across a lot of different corridors. But as a matter of fact, most of the corridors are the one you can see in the slide. So from Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar to Thailand, from Indonesia, Myanmar, Vietnam, and Singapore to Malaysia, and from Malaysia, Indonesia to Singapore. I think that there are 10 countries, so workers have a lot of different choices to go, but these corridors account for 95% of total migrant, of the total migrant population. How does a typical migrant workers in the ASEAN region look like? Migrant workers are mainly low-skilled workers. So here we show that 93% of total migrant workers have less than tertiary education, and 83% have less than secondary education. This is important to keep in mind because, as we will see in the next slide, the steps taken in the ASEAN region to facilitate mobility of workers mainly focused on high-skilled workers. But what we are really saying here is that the bulk of migration is really among low-skilled workers. Now, let me just say a couple of words about the drivers. So these are, in the slides, you can see the main corridors that we discussed earlier. All these corridors, except one, are between lower income countries and higher income countries. So migrant workers tend to go with countries with the lower level of development to countries with the higher level of development. And the exception flows from Singapore to Malaysia, in which Singapore is a higher income country compared to Malaysia. So in general, what workers do is moving in search of better economic opportunities. Wages in receiving countries are way higher. So just by crossing the borders, sometimes workers can see their wages multiplied to do the same type of job. Is the income the only reason behind migration? Not the only one. So what we can see is that the diversity of the region also manifests itself when we look at demographic patterns. So in the ASEAN region, we have aging societies like Singapore and Thailand. And also we have countries with very young population like Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia. So here what we do is to compare the median age of receiving countries with the median age of sending countries. And if you can see in Thailand and Singapore, median ages are way higher than in the sending countries. So is this something that is going to change in the future? No. What we show here is that in 2015, this is the situation. In 2050, the situation is going to be the same as well. This is true for Singapore and Thailand. Malaysia is slightly different. So Malaysia is not, the Malaysian population is not necessarily older of the population in ascending countries. So this is just to say that different demographic patterns and income differentials really drive migration flows. So now, so far I pointed out what the potential benefits are. So workers can move, they can earn higher wages, they can have access to better economic opportunities, and at the same time receiving countries can feel labor shortages. Aging population are going to face problem of low labor forces. So in a way, they're going to face labor shortages. Sending countries having younger population can really feel these labor shortages. So what does prevent workers from moving in the ASEAN region? So in the report, we have a very careful look at all the different type of barriers that limit workers from moving. And in general, we see that a lot of the discussion is often on specific barriers. There is rarely a comprehensive look at barriers to labor mobility. And what we present is evidence of potential barriers related to monetary cost. So what we see in the ASEAN region is that in many cases, migrant workers face higher monetary cost to migrate. And this can be recruitment cost, cost of documentation, cost of searching jobs. So they, out of pocket, they already need to spend a lot of money before even entering the receiving country. But also there are significant time costs. A worker that wants to go through formal channel often needs to take different steps, register with different agencies, go through very long processes, so it can take a lot of time before being able to move. So these are examples of the barriers that workers face, and there are several others that I'm going to mention in the next couple of slides. So what I'm trying to do now is to give examples, concrete examples of these barriers. So when it comes to monetary cost, what do we know? Here the World Bank and the ILO have conducted a systematic study of the cost of migration in different migration corridors. And in the ASEAN region, we have one specific corridor, which is the one from Vietnam to Malaysia. What we see is that on average, a Vietnamese worker that wants to move to Malaysia pays this amount, so $1,374. Which correspond to approximately 3 to 4 times the earnings, the wages, the monthly wages they can have in Malaysia. Which again, this means that a Vietnamese worker going to Malaysia, even before starting working, needs to repay 4 months of wages. And this is important to take into account when we talk about the consequences of high cost. Something else I would like to point to is that most of the cost, at least for Vietnamese workers to Malaysia, are fees paid to recruiters. So the role of recruitment agencies, the role of informal recruiters is very predominant in migration flows in this region and really drives costs up. Now, here what we try to do is also to look at indirect measures of migration cost. So what I said at the beginning is that barriers to labor mobility can be of different types. And some of them are not really quantifiable directly. So we cannot really directly put a cost on the barriers given by time delays, long procedures. So what we do is to try to estimate this cost indirectly. And so we apply some complex econometric technique based on the idea that we look at flows of labor in different jobs and wage differential, with the idea that when there are high wage differentials, but there are very low mobility flows, that means there must be very high barriers to labor mobility. So when we do that, we just want to have an idea of how much this costs are. And here we're talking about annual average wages, so the percentage of annual average wages. And you can see that to enter Malaysia, workers need to face a cost of approximately 3 times the annual average wages. Taking everything into account, the cost can be so high. Again, this is important to keep into account when we talk about the implication of high migration costs. So at the beginning, I said that the recruitment fees from Vietnamese workers to Malaysia can be as high as 3 to 4 month wages. When we take everything into account, the estimation goes up to approximately 3 times the annual average wage. Now, the implications. This is very important to reflect on. So when migration is costly, how do workers take the decision about migrating? First of all, what we see in the literature is that the poorest households are not going to be able to migrate. If costs are so high, poor households just don't have enough money to migrate. So if we think about migration as a potential poverty reduction strategy, these high costs really limit the potential impact of migration on poverty reduction. The second negative consequence, it's one that is very common in this region, is the tendency to migrate informally. So what happens is that workers who want to migrate formally face very high mobility costs, while by just crossing the border without registering with any agency, without paying any documentation cost, without queuing to get a job and to be matched to employers in receiving countries, workers can just get jobs. And this is relatively easy along some borders like Thailand, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, Malaysia, Indonesia. So for this reason, we see that there is a very large predominance of informal migration in East Asia. And what we do here in this slide is to compare the cost faced by Indonesian migrants that migrate to Malaysia formally and informally. And this is in different sectors. What you can see is that across different sectors, so for farm workers, construction workers, factory workers, and other workers, the cost of informal migration is always lower than the cost of formal migration. So this gives us a hint of why we see so much undocumented migration in the region. Now, I've talked about patterns of migration, drivers, barriers, and consequences of barriers. What about labor mobility in the ASEAN Economic Community? So we know that in 2015, the ASEAN Economic Community was established. And one of the objectives was free movement of capital, goods, services, investment, and skilled labor. So in a way, there is a recognition within ASEAN member states of the importance of free mobility, but specific to a certain group of workers, which is skilled workers. Now, if you remember what I said a few minutes ago, the majority of the migrant workers in ASEAN are low-skilled. We're talking about 93% of the population, of the migrant population in ASEAN has less than tertiary education. While the steps taken to facilitate labor mobility in the region are only focused on skilled workers. Now, another factor that doesn't make it better is that the steps, the instrument introduced to facilitate labor mobility, which are the mutual recognition arrangement, only cover certain occupations. There are about 7 or 8 occupations. So there are architects, nurses, dentists, accountants, tourist professionals, and other high-skilled service professions. And these professions only account for 5% of total employment in the ASEAN region. So very, very little. On top of this, being part of a mutual recognition agreement, being a profession in a mutual recognition agreement, doesn't mean that these workers in this profession get automatically a visa. So if I am an architect in Malaysia and I want to work in Thailand, yes, my qualifications are going to be recognized in Thailand, but this doesn't mean that I can access Thailand and work. I cannot get a visa. It just means that I'm recognized, which still is an impediment. And finally, as I already said this at the beginning of the discussion of this slide, this focus on skilled workers really doesn't cover the majority of the migration flows in the region. So now here we want to try to quantify what is lost because of these barriers to labor mobility. And in general, when we talk about trade integration, what a lot of economic models do is to assume that there are going to be there is free mobility of workers. So workers can really access new economic opportunities. And in general, what we see is that there is economic integration, there are new economic opportunities, there is growth in the different countries, and everyone is happy. In a way, what we want to do here is to look at what changes when we take into consideration the reality of labor mobility in ASEAN. So we compare the impact of economic integration with labor mobility cost and without labor mobility cost. And by comparing these scenarios, we get a sense of what is lost. What do we find? So first of all, we find that if we assume, if we model a reduction of labor mobility costs for skilled workers in the service sectors, we see significant welfare gains for all the workers in the different ASEAN countries. So these welfare gains can be approximately 15 or 14% for a typical workers in ASEAN. Can be higher in some countries, lower in some other countries, but in general, we see that welfare gains are there for all the workers in different ASEAN countries. But then we want to go one step further and assume that labor mobility costs can be reduced not only for the skilled workers, but for all the workers, which is the reality in ASEAN. Most of the mobility flow in ASEAN are low skilled, so why don't we assume a reduction in barriers to labor mobility for all of them? And we see in this case that welfare gains for workers are even higher, so around 29%, while 14% for only skilled workers, reducing labor mobility barriers to all the skilled workers. We're talking about 29, 30% for all workers. Now, the concept of welfare gains is a bit abstract. So I already see from your faces that you are wondering what I'm talking about with 14 and 29%. So what we do is trying to make this real and give an idea of what we're talking about when we talk about welfare gains. So we look at the impact of migration on migrants themselves. We look at the impact of migration on workers in receiving countries, and we look at the impact of migration on sending countries. I think that for migrants themselves, we all agree that migration is just one of the most effective poverty reduction strategy, because workers can just multiply their income by just crossing the borders. So welfare gains for migrant workers themselves are pretty clear. So workers move because they can have access to economic opportunity. What sometimes is a bit less straightforward, especially it's a source of debate for receiving country, is the impact on destination economies. And in many cases, there is the perception that migrant workers can have a detrimental impact on the wages of local workers. They can create unemployment, and so they can crowd out the local workforce. Something that is very important to keep in mind when we look at the impact of migrants on receiving countries is the characteristic of migrants as opposed to the characteristic of the labor force in the receiving countries. And we are in Singapore, so why don't we think a bit about how the situation looks like here in Singapore. So the majority of migrant workers in Singapore is low skilled, and Singapore has a very highly educated workforce. So in a way, this sentiment of negative impacts in Singapore is not really, and the data confirmed this in the case of Thailand and Malaysia, is not really confirmed by data. Why is that? Because workers, so low-skilled workers, really take jobs that are not covered by the local workforce. Just to give you another example, in Malaysia, we see that there are a lot of migrant workers in the plantation sector. And these are jobs that usually the local workforce is not taking. So what happens is that by filling skill shortages, migrant workers allow employers to expand output, to produce more. And when output is expanded, employers are automatically going to create more jobs even for local workers. And so this is what we see in Malaysia, for example, and in Thailand as well.
I think it's well documented in Singapore by several economists that the influx of low-skilled migrant workers has actually crippled productivity gains in Singapore. Because, like for example, in the construction industry, there's no shortage of Japanese construction workers working in Japan or Australian construction workers working in Australia, because they employ productivity at a very high level, and the wages of local workers are very high. Whereas even our ministers have commented that the
just churn through them, very low wage workers. So they bring in, exploit, traffic, and some of them are not traffic, of course, but there's a high degree of exploitation. And so that drives down productivity overall within the construction sector. So I'm just curious as to what evidence you have, that seems to contradict what the ministers and the economists are pointing out.
No, that's a very similar story we heard in Malaysia. So we have been engaged very extensively in Malaysia. And one of the reasons why we first started working on Malaysia was because there was a concern of negative impact on the local workforce, on the negative impacts on productivity. So we started working on that, and we tried to have a very careful look at the data. And there were some evidence that migrant workers will depress wages in Malaysia. Then when we look better at the data, what we found is that if we look at the wages of the total workforce, there are some negative impacts. But then if you disentangle the effect on the existing migrants and the local workforce, actually the negative impacts are all on the existing migrants. They're not on the local workforce. So in a way, what we see is that the negative impacts are really felt by those that directly compete with the foreign workers, not so much by those that do not compete with them.
The other issue is the productivity issue, which is what several about. Singapore's productivity has been flat for the last 20 years, and productivity in construction has actually been negative. And there's no incentive for contractors to develop the kinds of technologies that they have in developed countries because there's a constant flow of low-wage migrant workers. If they get injured, they can just ship them back.
Yeah, and again, I think that this is an hypothesis that we heard in Malaysia as well. And we try to look at the data. So we look at their firm census and see whether there was any impact on productivity. And we don't see any. So we hear these stories, and it might be true in some cases, but on average, when we look at the general impact on the migrant workforce, we don't see that. The negative impact on wages, we can see some negative impacts on the workers that are very low skilled in Malaysia. But now, again, what we reflect on is that this portion of the workforce in Malaysia is very low because Malaysian workers just get a lot of education. And I guess this is probably the case in Singapore as well, where it must be very hard to find workers with no level of education, which then compete with the local.
That's the point. In Australia and Japan, the construction workers are educated and they're paid a decent wage. So it's an attractive society. First, there's a barrier to, like in Japan, you cannot get a visa to work as a construction worker. It's very difficult to get that. So the productivity levels of Japanese construction workers is extraordinarily high. In Singapore and Malaysia, I'd be very interested to read your methodology. I don't want to hold up the presentation. But it's very interesting because it seems counterintuitive. And it flies in the face of the data that we have in productivity and construction in Japan, Australia, and Europe compared to Singapore and Malaysia.
No, and I think that you're bringing up a very important point, which is how the migration system really needs to be aligned with economic needs. And so there are ways to do it. I think that Singaporean government is trying to do this with the levy, with the revision of the levies. But I mean, I'm happy to talk more about this and share more about the methodology.
We have a Q&A section later on.
Okay, so we talk about impact on the receiving economies. On sending economies, what we see is that via remittances, income really goes up and there is a poverty reduction effect of migration. So even the population in sending countries can benefit from migration. So when we talk about positive impact on welfare, we talk about positive impact on the migrant themselves, in most of the workers in the receiving countries, and on workers and the population in sending countries as well. Now, then the next step is really try to understand how can governments have an impact on migration cost. Because we talk about the barriers, we talk about the negative impact that these barriers have on migration, but then what is the role of government in reducing this migration cost? So what we try to do here is to look at migration systems in a holistic way. And this is because in many cases in the policy debate, we hear a lot about a focus on restriction on the quantity of migrants or border enforcement. And these are often seen as the most important measures to take to control migration. But what we argue in this report is that migration systems are comprehensive and span through different components, and break down in all the different components have an impact on migration cost. So what we do to break down the migration system is that we identify the governance of the migration system plus 4 additional components. And these components would be the admissions, so the entry path, the quantity restriction, and the recruitment. The employment, so we talk about the terms, the employment terms, and the protection. We talk about the exits, so incentives and sanctions, as well as diaspora engagement and reintegration, and then the enforcement of the migration system. And what we argue in the report is that breakdown in the migration system, in all of the components in the migration system, lead to high mobility cost. Now, what are the typical weaknesses that we see in a migration system? First of all, migration system, as we just talked, may be slow in responding to economic needs. In some countries, we see that economic conditions evolve, but the quantity restrictions stay the same. If the idea is to have migration to fill skills shortages, to help employers fill labor gaps, we would expect quantity restriction to be evolving with economic conditions. Then the second weaknesses that we see is a lack of coordination between sending and receiving countries, and even within a country between the different stakeholders involved in the migration process. So this really leads to some gray area. One of the examples is on the recruitment process, where sometimes it's not clear who is in charge of regulating recruitment agencies. The third point is information asymmetries. And this is particularly the case in this region when workers are mainly low-skilled and they lack the information about job opportunities in the receiving countries, and so they can be easily exploited. Then we talk about the ability of employers and recruitment agencies to extract rents from the system because of these significant information asymmetries. And finally, there is a tendency in the region to focus on the short-term benefits of migration or short-term negative impacts of migration, forgetting a bit sometimes the long-term objective of a migration system. So having said this, what can countries do to reduce this migration cost? So in the report, we identify 5 priority areas, and then we also distinguish priorities based on sending countries, receiving countries, level of development, and sophistication of the migration system. So the first priority area is improving the governance of the migration system. Sometimes this is forgotten because we see that in many cases, and this is not the case in Singapore, we see agencies with exactly the same role. So migrants, in order to be formal, in order to go through all the regular channel, they need to repeat the same process first with an agency and then with the other agencies, exactly the same process. So it can take very long time to get all the required documents. Second, we talk about deepening and widening collaboration among all stakeholders. Again, this really is related to the importance of involving employers when it comes to decision about migration restriction. Sometimes announcements are made about changes in migration restriction, and employers get very surprised, there are backlash. So it's important to make sure that the discussion are taken into account inputs from employers. Then the third very important point is the utilization of data, information, and transparency in the migration process. So if we want to really have a migration system which is aligned with economic needs, we need to think of how for a decision to be taken based on objective data. So the role of data is very important. Information as well is important because given all the information asymmetries, to empower migrants and to give them the possibility to be informed about all the employment opportunities and not to be taken advantage of, is important to give an important role on information and share information. And then transparency. So there is something very good about the Singaporean system, as a lot of countries are very jealous about that, is how the employers can go in the website, list all their the workforce numbers, and then can automatically know how many foreign workers they can hire. So this is really a transparent way to communicate in advance how many foreign workers employers can hire, and it's important for planning purposes for employers. balancing protection and economic development is important, especially in the case of sending countries. There is a strong focus on deploying foreign workers, so giving the opportunity to foreign workers to have access to economic opportunities in other countries. And there is also the worry that these workers may not be protected. However, over-regulating can also be a problem, because then these workers may decide not to go to the formal channels because they really need to follow too many steps and take too much time. And finally, what is important to keep into account is that migration is part of the broader human capital development strategy of a country. So linking migration policies to education policies, training policies, understanding how the different objectives are reached by different type of policies is very important. Okay, so this is, here I just give examples of how these best practices across the region can be implemented to reach this objective. So for example, when it comes to the governance of the migration system, as I said, there are some countries in which there are duplicative roles of different agencies. Korea, the Philippines, and Singapore are a good example because there is one agency that is in charge of migration. There are interministerial committees that give inputs, but at the end of the day, time is short. Time is not too long with duplicative procedure because there is one agency taking the lead. When it comes to collaboration with stakeholders, the UK and also Australia are good examples because they are structured processes to get the inputs of the private sector. So it's the consultation with the private sector are not sporadic, are not occasional. It just happens in a structured way and according to a preset timeline. Also, when it comes to coordination between sending and receiving countries, the Philippines really offer a good model of a country that has been able to negotiate bilateral level agreement and have the voice heard in the negotiation with receiving countries. I already talked about example of transparency in the case of Singapore, and so the possibility to be very upfront with employers on what is the number of workers they can get. Again, on the point of balancing protection, economic development, in Indonesia specifically, we see that foreign workers really need to go through a lot of steps to become formal. So lately, there have been initiatives to try to consolidate the different steps to have one-stop centers that limit the steps the foreign workers need to take. And so steps in this direction are important to avoid that there is an over-regulation to protect migrant workers. And finally, for domestic policies here, we bring the example of a project in China where in order to facilitate movement or internal movement of workers, rural workers are given information about employment opportunities, training opportunities, and even legal advice in order to maximize the impact of the migration experience. Okay, so these are really the country-specific policies that I think we can skip. In general, the main point here I would stress is that for receiving countries, it's important to align migration policy to economic needs. So if the objective is really to fill skills shortages, then migration policies need to take into account what are the evolving conditions of the economy. And so channels and structure to take that into account are very important. And for sending countries, again, there needs to be a focus on deploying workers, so helping workers to take advantage of migration opportunities, but also protecting them and potentially trying to incentivize reintegration and maximizing the benefits from reintegration if these workers decide to come back. Okay, I know I went a bit longer than I was supposed to do, but I'm done now.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Mauro, for your very comprehensive and insightful presentation. Now I open floor audience for Q&A. Because this talk is recorded, so please use microphone, identify yourself, and raise your question very clearly and concisely. Okay, go. Use microphone.
Yeah. Thank you for your presentation. Extremely enriching and a very interesting topic to all of us. I just wanted, I'm Shashwat Srivastav. I'm studying MPA. That's the Public Administration course here. I'm from India, with an interest in vocational education and technical training. So my question actually is about India and Japan. Very recently, Japan, for the need of migrant workforce, especially in the construction sector, given that it's a run-up to the Olympics and the aging population and most of the things that you addressed, there has been a lot of interest from India. In a bilateral sense, the governments are trying to work together, but my little involvement was trying to get semi-skilled to high-skilled workers from India to Japan. And what Japan is actually doing, and I may be wrong in another sense, they're looking to go through the route of technical interns apprenticeship programs. It's the TITP. My question to you is actually your thoughts. Are apprenticeship the right way of channeling skilled workers into a country? I mean, I find this a very gray area because you take them in and then you keep extending them year on year. Apprenticeship are a very different thing from people working on the assembly line, and I would like to be honest, we all know apprentices are used in the productivity cycle. So is this the right way of going about it? Thank you.
Are we taking, okay. Okay, so I didn't know about this bilateral agreement between India and Japan. Maybe I can share a bit the experience of other countries that have tried that. So I think that you pointed out to one important factor to take into account, which is how are these workers used, and whether they are used on a long-term basis on this type of contract, or whether they are used just for short-term period. And also, what is the protection, what is the labor law covering these workers as opposed to local workers? Now, in Korea, they started with the internship industrial training scheme, which was something very similar, in which workers were brought to Korea as trainees. And the idea was to keep them for short-term period, and then when the labor shortages were filled, they would have gone back home. And then what happened is that these workers really stayed for a long period, and there was a tendency for these workers to be undocumented and to go in the legal sector. So in a way, what Korea realized is that because of these shortcomings, this type of contract arrangements were not working. So they moved to the EPS, which is the employment permit system, which guarantees full protection and full rights to the foreign workers. So in a way, something to understand a bit better about the Japan-India arrangement is whether this type of contract will really be covering short-term period, and whether there is this type of contracts also will undercut the local population. Because something that is absolutely to avoid is to provide contracts and provide wage conditions that then will be detrimental for the local population.
Turn on your micro.
Okay, thank you. Turn it on. There we go. Thank you. My name's Margaret Walton Roberts. I'm actually from Canada. I'm a professor at the Balsillie School of International Affairs, and I'm visiting research scholar at the Asia Research Institute here at NUS. I'm quite interested in, you talked about mutual recognition agreements under the ASEAN Economic Community, and although it is skilled, and I think it only covers 7 or 8 occupations, one of the dimensions of the mutual recognition agreement that I find interesting is, in some ways, there might, whether or not you think there is a wider potential kind of virtuous element of the mutual recognition agreement model, which is the idea of sharing best practices between the regulatory professional agencies. So I'm interested in nursing and the mobility of nurses throughout ASEAN, and the agreement between all of the countries when they signed on to it is this idea of sharing best practices. And in some ways, I wonder if you think that may be an element of the spirit of the MRA agreements, even if it's not actually happening in practice.
Shall I go? No, yeah, I mean, for that purposes, I think that MRAs are very beneficial in terms of changing the practices and creating also a forum for discussion about different ASEAN countries. The issue is that when we talk about the mobility of workers in ASEAN, and then we talk about the instrument and the measure implemented to have this mobility, I think the MRAs are a less suitable instrument to favor the mobility of the skilled workers. But definitely the MRAs, as well as other initiatives taken by the ASEAN Economic Community, are good in the sense of creating a forum for different countries to discuss and to share best practices. So for that purpose, I think that those are beneficial interventions.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think the other issue, I mean, you're absolutely right. They have this potential. I think what our point on the MRAs is quite apart from the fact that they cover only a very small group, they're also designed in ways that they really, one has to wonder whether the spirit and the reality are very far apart. I mean, one example, for instance, is, on architects. So if they want to move to Thailand, they can move, but they need to do a test in Thai, which I would argue is a rather onerous requirement if you're from the Philippines, well, if you're from anywhere, right? I mean, perhaps if you're from Laos or Cambodia, you might find it a little bit easier. But I think that's the real issue, and I think this is where ASEAN, I think our take on ASEAN integration is it's been very successful in some regards, but I think on labor and on services more generally, they have been much less forthcoming. Now, I understand why. I mean, ASEAN and the nature of decision-making in ASEAN is such that these things move by consensus and they move slowly. But I think one also has to recognize that at this pace, the ASEAN Economic Community is going to take a long time before it truly comes to fruition.
Hi, my name is Richa. I am a PhD student, and my thesis is actually on labor migration governance in Asia. My question to you is about the ASEAN Economic Community and how it's kind of intentional that they've only focused on 8 professions that are 5%, while disregarding, or at least for now not touching, the vast majority of labor migration that happens in the region. And you talk about a lot of numbers and how it's good for migration cost and all of that, but for sending countries like Singapore, Malaysia, I mean, for receiving countries, I don't know, the intention for them is not maybe only about the cost to migrants and the benefits. It's, especially for low-skilled migrants, it's about having them come in, work, and then leave, have the circular migration without the benefits and all of that, right? So what can your report suggest to migrant workers or sending countries to help that issue, that maybe the numbers are not enough to convince?
Shall I? Yeah. This is it's interesting that you ask this question, because it was just discussing with someone about exactly the same issue. As a matter of fact, also with Professor Wu, if you think about the objectives of countries like Thailand and Malaysia, these objectives are really projected to be knowledge-based economy and champions in innovation. And while the current model of employing a lot of migrant workers, in some cases in an undocumented way to fill labor shortages, plantation in labor-intensive sector, has worked in the past, the real question is this going to work when this country wants to transform to be knowledge-based economy, and so to move towards automation? So in a way, it is true that these countries will care less about the rights of the migrant worker themselves, but even if they don't care about the rights of migrant workers, I think they care about their economic growth. And having this large pool of undocumented workers can really prevent them from having their objective to become knowledge-based, innovation-led economies.
Can I just, I mean, I also want to link this to your earlier question about, Singapore. Now, I don't know Singapore at all, right? My excuse is I work at the World Bank, so, Singapore's moved on and it's a developed country. But my sense is what it comes down to is a point that Mauro made about balancing labor protection. I think, you may be, at the end of the day, not all construction jobs are going to be automated. There is, in every country in the world. I mean, what we just heard about Japan, right? To build stadia, yes, you're going to have a lot of capital, but you actually do need human beings, right? Now, the real question, I think, is, are you getting flows as a receiving country, as a richer country, as a Thailand or a Malaysia or a Singapore in this region? Are you getting these flows of labor at artificially low rates? That, I think, is the real question. And that is a question of labor protection. So, I don't want you to get this wrong, right? The headline from this report is not deregulate labor flows within ASEAN and everyone will reach nirvana. That is not the message of this report. The message of this report is that a lot of policies and institutions that are currently in place, either under the claim of protecting native workers, as in Malaysia or in Thailand, or in the name of encouraging economic development, are misplaced. So what you really need are policies that take seriously the formalization of these flows. So in a sense, the worst thing that's happening in terms of labor flows, and and the 6.9 million number we use, remember, it's not the real number. There's large numbers of people floating across borders without, especially in the continental Southeast Asian countries, without documents. That is a real problem, because when they're undocumented, we know that is when they get taken advantage of. That is when they are not paid enough. That is when they're not protected. So what this report really is it's about improving policies. That there is, and there is, in our view, an area around which there can be consensus. And part of what this report says is, and that's actually, frankly, one of the advantages of an organization like ASEAN, is because it includes countries at very different levels of development, there's actually scope for learning here. There is a lot that countries can learn from how the Philippines manages its migration. There's a lot that countries can learn from how Singapore manages as a receiving country, including what Malaysia can learn. And that is part of what we want to try to convey.
Yeah, thanks very much. That's very reassuring, because from the tone, it sounded a bit like the move was to reduce barriers and open the floodgates and race to the bottom, that kind of thing, which unfortunately has been associated with many of the international institutions for a long time. The globalization is perceived as being a race to the bottom, where you reduce wages to the point at which you find the people are willing to work at the lowest possible wages. But I think what was really interesting about the presentation earlier on, and I think this is where the strength of the bank is in itself, is providing information, the information asymmetry. Even in Singapore, it's been so difficult to get pay slips or automatic payment of workers, and every day in the newspapers we read stories of workers who are denied wages, and it's a catch-22 situation, because the labor protections, especially even of documented workers, are relatively weak compared to what they are in many developed countries. So if you, as an organization, are able to sort of set the standard in terms of transparency, what are the best practices, and but unfortunately, I don't think anywhere in ASEAN we are anywhere near some of the practices of most of the developed countries, even within the more developed countries within ASEAN.
Right, and that is, again, it goes back to this point we made earlier, that ASEAN needs to start thinking beyond the MRAs, right? So, it's a little bit of a harsh message to convey, because, most of ASEAN, all of ASEAN are member states, they're member countries of the World Bank, but I think we do want to send the message that MRAs is not the end. Don't declare victory on the basis of MRAs. You're a long way, and it isn't that all, these are difficult issues, right? I mean, you see migration is a thorny issue in developed countries. It's a thorny issue in the European Union, right? Which has far less disparities within it than does ASEAN.
Okay, I work for the Embassy of Spain. I'm the market analyst for the region for tourism, for Spain Tourism Board. I just would like to comment, maybe ask you on your, I'd like to go back to the last part of your presentation wherein you said, and by the way, I'm actually taking ASEAN Studies at the moment, a graduate certificate in the University of the Philippines. I'd like to go back on your last slide, I think, on policies to lower the barriers to labor mobility. Did you rank that in random? Because I'm quite interested to know from you, for example, if you are to consult and sit down on labor policies for the AEC, what would be, among the 5 factors that you mentioned, what would be, in your opinion, the first factor that should be put on top? Because you mentioned here reform of domestic policies, and you have mentioned also balance of protection and usage of data and information and so forth. And just a side comment, I'm actually Singaporean now. I've been living here 19 years. I was born in Manila, and I lived in Vietnam for 5 years. I have to correct you in your notion about the Philippines, because you categorize the Philippines together with Singapore and Korea on their labor policies. I think what we read and what we probably hear are different, entirely different from what's really happening on the ground. Just recently, I had experience on helping a Singaporean who's now a coach, head coach of one of the football clubs there, and I was shocked that instead of issuing work permit, he was asked to go to the Games and Amusement Board, which is, not at all related to football coaching, for example. So those 2 comments for you.
No, I'm just, I understood the comments.
Yes.
Yeah. No, if you can just repeat the question. I understood the comments.
Yes, the question is, what would you rank as the first important factor from the policies to lower the barriers on labor mobility? The 5 factors that you mentioned to improve governance, deepen collaboration, usage of data. If you will be asked to be a consultant for the AEC on labor, what would you rank as number 1 out of these 5? Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So I believe that the different countries in ASEAN, given the diversity of the economic development, their different experience with developing migration system, they have all different priorities. So I can give you an example of where each of these priorities would be important. So when it comes to Indonesia, there is really an urgency to reform the institutional framework and to improve the governance. Because as I said, the same role is really duplicated between the Ministry of Manpower and another agency under the Prime Minister's Department. So what migrant workers need to do is to go twice to the same process. So this is, I see as improving governance as one of the main priorities for the government of Indonesia. When it comes to deepening and widening collaboration among all stakeholders, I think that Singapore has a very developed and sophisticated system, but at the end of the day, what is missing is really collaboration with sending countries. Singapore does a lot of things very well within the borders, but what we can see is also that some of the issues come already when migrants are in their sending countries. So sometimes migrants pay very high recruitment costs in their sending countries. They come to the country and then they already come with a very high debt. So in a way, they need to recoup the cost. And at that point, there is very little that Singapore can do because the costs were incurred before moving here. So better collaboration with sending countries would be something that I would think as a priority for Singapore. When it comes to data, information, and transparency, I think that that's something that speaks to the needs of the Malaysian government. So Malaysia, like Singapore, has a system of levies. So these levies are used to control the quantity of migrants. And the idea is that if you adjust the levy, you can have an influence of the quantity of foreign workers in the country. So what we see is that over the last, I believe, 10 to 15 years, levies have been changed twice or 3 times. If the idea is to respond to economic needs and to adjust the quantity of foreign workers depending on your economic needs, you really need to be more responsive. And so using data, so using information about unemployment rate, productivity, about wages, in order to change the levy rates. When it comes to balancing protection and economic development, I think that the Philippines are trying to move towards this model from first pushing migration as a way to alleviate employment pressure, so to get a job. Now there is more of a focus on protection, and also now on reintegration. I think in a way of the sophisticated Filipino system, something which is still a bit missing is a focus on the reintegration, making sure that workers that come back home, they really can use their skills. So I mean, I would say that I will think that these are how I will see the priorities of different countries according to this 4 areas.
Okay, now we have 5 minutes left. So we can collect 3 questions in a row so that we can have the last 3 questions.
Hello, my name is Aarti Raghavan, and I'm pursuing Masters in Public Policy here at Kuan School. Recently, I had an opportunity to attend at an ASEAN conference, and I was representing the issues of skilled labor in ASEAN, and I was representing Myanmar. So one of the problems that Myanmar currently faces is that of brain drain, for example. In their case, they have enough skilled labor, however not certified skilled labor. So the challenge for the government in Myanmar is that they need to certify their skilled labor at a very fast pace, and they're actually struggling with it, and they need external bodies to help them out with this. And for them, they have actually agreed to the free movement as being part of the ASEAN community. However, they can't really afford to send their skilled workforce out, because for them, their public services are facing a strain if they send out their skilled workforce. So if your report, if it's suggesting that free mobility is actually a positive impact, in Myanmar's case, how is it that they can handle? For example, your last suggestion for policy is to reform domestic policies. So what should be their priority in terms of the current impact they're having in terms of brain drain?
Hi, I'm Samir. I'm an MPP student here at the Lee Kuan Yew School. My question was referring and sort of building off your comments on labor protection and formalizing the informal labor flows into ASEAN countries. You prior mentioned that informal labor migration is far cheaper than formal labor migration. I was wondering if you had any commentary on sort of mechanisms to bridge that gap specifically.
The last question. Okay, so go ahead.
Yeah, let me start with the brain drain question. So what we found during the work we did on this report, and which opened a bit our eyes on the question of brain drain, is how we define brain drain and what are really the costs for the sending society. So in general, one of the issues about brain drain is that countries are perceived as having the cost of educating workers, but then these workers live abroad. So there is some new research that shows that actually the patterns of high-skill migration are a bit more complex. So sometimes workers already get educated abroad, and then they get job abroad. So in a way, in that case, the question is that really brain drain? So is the case in which high-skilled workers get their education abroad and then they work abroad a case of brain drain? So this is one of the problem of definition of brain drain. Second, there is some research that shows that in countries in which migration is possible and high-skilled migration is possible, more workers, more local workers trying to get education with the hope that then they will later migrate. But at the end of the day, not all of them eventually migrate. So in a way, the prospect of migrating lead workers to acquire more education. And then some of them stay back. So at this, it really increased the pool of high-skilled workers. Having said this, is brain drain a fiction? Is this a made-up concept? No. In some cases, we see that countries suffer from brain drain. So in a way, there is an increased focus of countries towards trying to keep their diaspora engaged, having return programs, but as you described, sometimes there is nothing for migrants to return to. So thinking that they will ever come back in the short term is very hard because there are no job opportunities. So a way the countries that try to address this issue is to be in touch with their diaspora, even if they stay abroad, but trying to incentivize investment or knowledge sharing. And this is something that tends to attenuate the issue with brain drain. On the cost of undocumented migration as opposed to the one of documented migration. So in a way, one of the issues and some of the priorities are related to where the cost arises for different countries. Now, again, just taking the case of Indonesia, or even the case of Malaysia, when in order for an employer to get a foreign worker, it takes 3 months to 1 year. So we have estimates showing that for an employer to have a foreign workers, it may take up to 1 year. In that case, you can understand that the cost, not necessarily the monetary cost, but the time cost is going to be very high. So in that case, simplifying the institutional framework, streamline procedures can really bring down the cost. And so increasing the incentive for formal migration. When there is a lot of undocumented migration and there is a role for recruitment agencies to make a lot of rents, some countries have tried to move towards a more controlled recruitment system in which the government plays an important role. And in the case of Korea that I mentioned before, moving from a private recruitment model to a public recruitment model really reduced migration costs significantly. Now, is public recruitment the solution to all the issues? Not really, because public recruitment, first of all, is very expensive to manage, and then the public sector is not necessarily best equipped to do all the recruitment. But a stricter regulation of the recruitment agencies can really lead costs down. And then just by sharing information. So initiative like introducing star rating system for recruitment agencies. So having public information showing what are the agencies that perform better, recruitment agencies that perform better, and the one that perform worse, so that not many migrants will go through the recruitment agencies that do not perform better. So these are examples of how migration costs can be reduced.
Can I just push up just one more point on the brain drain? And to be honest, I don't know the Myanmar case, but let me just reflect on, one of the priorities here is about reforming domestic policies. And usually, I mean, if you look at, I come from a generation in India where the biggest goal of most of us who were educated was to get the heck out of there, right? Because there were no jobs, or there were jobs, but they didn't pay very well. You look at India today, right? The schools that I went to 35 years ago, the main goal of people right now is not to get the heck out of India. It's to stay in India. Now, what's happened? What's happened is there are good jobs. Now, they're not good jobs for everyone, but they're good jobs for highly educated people. So I would argue, it's again not to say that there isn't such a thing as brain drain, but a lot of this is under the control of, it is a policy-induced thing. It's not something that magically happens. And countries have it in their control to change this. Now, there's not a switch here that you can push on and off, but there is, but it is, when you see large, and one of the reasons the Philippines has been such a large sending country is a reflection of the failure of the Philippines over many decades to create good jobs. That was the biggest push for migration. And what you now see is that being corrected in the Philippines. Again, it's not going to happen instantaneously. It's not going to happen with 1 or 2 years of high growth, but over a long period, that's what happens, and that's what changes the equilibrium in these markets.
Yeah, I think actually Dr. Shetty just made a very important point. You have to make your own country the home of your own people, and the home, stands for hope, opportunity, memory, and engagement. So people have to come back, even they work anywhere, but have come back to serve the country. That's a great thing. And I think you enjoyed the talk a lot, and please join me thanking our speaker today, Dr. Shetty and Francis. Thank you so much.